Yeah, so the question is what's the meaning and status of customary law, whether it's law like normal law or whether it's different. So in international law, it's equal to, in terms of nature, as written law or as treaties, and meaning that it can be applied, it can be enforced, and even you have a number of case law decisions by tribunals using customary law to assess the situation of people. One example is the tribunal of Nuremberg, prosecuting the Nazis commanders and sentencing them to a harsh sentence. Most of the decisions were based on customary law at that time. So it can be can have very precise impact, very important direct impact.
Thank you.
Okay, so okay, so it's an informal session. So for informal questions and comments, possibly, it's good. Okay, any subject, not only IHL,
yes.
but
hello,
ICRC.
I'm Venerable Devinda from SLPU. I have a question, maybe one or two. You presented as a IHL, right? IHL, IHRL. And how do you manage to convey this message that international law to many arms groups in Myanmar, and especially in Shan State, we have many arms groups, whether you have reached them or to spread the message of the international law. And if they don't respect that law, if they violate, how do you do with that? Okay, thank you.
Very good one. So for Stefan.
Well, I think that there is a part of the question, and I invite after any of my colleagues to complement, of course, and Andrew or the others. One thing we should not lose of sight, it's that even if the Geneva Conventions were signed or were created, in 1949, in Myanmar, they were just signed by the government in 1992. So officially, the Geneva Conventions have been recognized by Myanmar not a long time ago. And I think that we are all still at a stage when we need to promote and to explain and to even translate what is in this body of law. Today there is not even an official translation in Myanmar of the Geneva Conventions. There is several practical ones, working ones, but so I think we are still at a very early stage, and we need to promote this law, because if people don't know the law, they cannot respect it. Of course, we will, and we have already started a lot with the state. The state is always easier, because when you want to promote IHL, you can go to the government, you can go to the army, you can go to the universities, and you will always find people who are interested to listen to that. So today the Icrc has already started a little bit this dialogue some years ago, of course with the military, because they are the number one audience. But we also try with the universities in Yangon, the law universities. This morning we explained that we try also to share with the civil society, because we think the citizen, they should know a little bit about that. Maybe not to become expert, but to know a little bit what they have the right. So we try to do it with everybody, with also the press. Sometimes we call the journalists and we make sessions, because if you read the newspapers in Myanmar, even the journalists, sometimes they are lost between human rights, IHL, they don't know exactly. So there is a big work, and that's why Sylvain has been hired this year we wanted a bit of more support for that. We have other people in our team who are working on how to do this. With the armed groups, it's always, not only in Myanmar, but it's always a little bit more challenging because I will generalize a little bit, but armed groups are a little bit less structured. Sometimes they are in remote places. Sometimes they are difficult to reach or even to meet, because especially if the conflict is ongoing. So it's true that for us, it is maybe a lower level of engagement than we have with the authorities. But we try as much as we can, and every time there is a possibility, to sit down with representatives of any group in any country in the world. And if they have an interest, we will always share our knowledge with them. We don't make any difference. So, in concrete terms, what I can tell you, but I cannot give a lot of details because we are very careful, but in Myanmar, sometimes when we see that one armed group is doing something really wrong, for example, shooting an ambulance or shooting a CSO who is trying to help, we already had our own ways to communicate with them and to tell them, you have obligation under international humanitarian law. What you did should really try to be avoided in the future. And believe me, sometimes we have some positive response. They say, okay, we will try not to do it again. We will talk to our people and tell them, try to refrain from doing that. Sometimes we don't even receive an answer. And we don't know if our message had any kind of impact. It's very different depending on the place, depending on the time, depending on the group. But we really try to share with them our humanitarian concerns. Another thing that we do is that we don't only talk about IHL with them, because IHL is the legal part and it's the rules, but we also try to explain them a little bit like my colleague did this morning in 45 minutes. We try to explain them everything we do, because we need their trust and their confidence to go on the field. If I go somewhere in the mountains in Shan or in the mountains in Kachin, I really want everybody to know what ICRC is doing, because I don't want any problem for my teams. I am responsible for their security, and the best weapon that we have against these security threats, it is to be open and to really explain what we do. And sometimes, most of the time in Myanmar, even the armed groups, they welcome our presence. They say, don't worry, we understand what you do, we respect it, you can go, we will not do anything against you. This is the majority of the situation. That is why we could work and we can work sometimes in difficult place, thankfully without major incident today. We did not have any major incident in Myanmar. Of course, you can have an incident anytime, but we try to communicate that, not only IHL, but also what we are doing for the communities. And just to finish with this dialogue with armed groups, we also had cases of groups who asked our opinion on how they should organize their own regulations for fighting to better respect IHL. Some of them, they call and they say, how can I do my rules of engagement in a way that respects the civilian population? Can you give me your expertise for that? And of course, if someone asks our expertise, we will share it. So yes, it's quite a lot of things we can do, but it depends on, indeed, the level of interest, the access, the security, and unfortunately, of course, we cannot do everything everywhere. We have to be very humble and very modest with our real impact, because you know better than us that many things are done in total disrespect of IHL, not only in Myanmar, everywhere in the world. And there is a big work of promoting. And I am a firm believer that anybody in the society can be a little ambassador of IHL. It can be religious groups, it can be CSOs, it can be journalists. I think that if everybody knows a little bit that, it can be a positive message for the population.
Thank you.
To let people know about ICRC, do you have Facebook page and tell in Thai language to like radio? Do you have this kind of channel to share about ICRC? Media, yeah. Do you use media to?
Yes.
Yeah.
Usually we have many people in our teams, and Kate, who is present here, she is the head of our communication in this country. She's trying to see all the possible means to pass our message. Recently, for example, she did a big campaign in Shan and I think also in Rakhine, using the radio and the social media to talk about the risks of anti-personal minds, for people to know what to do, what not to do. So we try to use the local media, especially in Myanmar where the language are so different. You cannot do only one thing on MRTV and everybody will see it. You need to use all the different channels. So it's a bit challenging for us, but we try.
If you always tell, share knowledge about ICRC every day, one day, 10 minutes, 30 minutes every day, so people will notice that. For example, you talk in people life, so that is very first to let people know about ICRC. Thank you.
We will take this advice, huh? Kate, you take note, and then after.
Yes, Dr. Hugh Hartsick.
Thank you. I'm interested to know if ICRC ever becomes involved politically, for instance, in peace negotiations or conflict resolution, or maybe you try to avoid having any political role.
I think it was very well said by some of the colleagues this morning. ICRC is not involved in peace negotiations in general, because the content of the negotiation in any country is usually related to security, related to politics, related to power sharing, and these things are very sensitive, and we really think that the people who are the best placed to discuss that are either the people of the country themselves or organizations who are really helping for peace process. And here in Myanmar, there is other countries who are sometimes helping Myanmar to try to organize the peace with more or less success. But one thing which I noticed in my life, I've been 20 years with ICRC in different countries, is that sometimes our work can be a good contribution to the peace for the future. I will give a very simple example. Number one, this is not in Myanmar. This is in another country called Colombia. Sometimes the government and the armed groups, they were so much distrusting each other that they didn't want to meet on the territory of the enemy or to travel on the other side. So they were asking ICRC to go with our transportation, our planes, and to take them in a third country for them to negotiate. So here we can have sometimes a role, we call it neutral intermediary. If the two sides cannot talk, sometimes because we are neutral, we can organize the place for the talk. Another role of neutral intermediary, it is when two sides want to release prisoners, for example. Sometimes it's very difficult when you want to release a prisoner, because the group who released the prisoner doesn't want to expose himself. So they call sometimes the ICRC to go and take the prisoner and to bring him to the other side. And we can do it in the two directions. This is another role we can do anywhere in the world. And last but not least, the experience shows that sometimes the different parties who are doing the peace, during the peace negotiation, they usually have a long list of topics. Land ownership, taxes, who will be in the army, who will be in the police, many, many, many things. But sometimes we see that it can be very positive if on the table they also talk about a number of humanitarian issues. I was talking about Colombia. In Colombia, when the government was negotiating with the armed groups, the armed group is called the FARC in Colombia, they were talking about 3 humanitarian confidence-building negotiation, they say. Number 1, if we make the peace, we should give the mortal remains, the dead soldiers, back to the family of the other side. Because many people who died during the conflict, they stayed in places where the family could not take the body back. So they say, if we do the peace, the number 1 step for the dignity of the family is that we will exchange the location of the grave sites. And ICRC helped them to localize the place. Number 2, they say, we will stop recruiting children in our groups, but we need to build a future for them. And here again, they ask ICRC, can you help us to do this? And we said yes. And number 3, another trust-building measure was to exchange information on where are the land mines. Because if you do the peace, you want economy to start again, but it is very difficult to do agriculture or to go back for the IDPs if there is landmines. So they decided that there would be also the issue of the landmines to be discussed. And here again, ICRC was trying to help them to find concrete solutions. So if we are invited in the peace process, and if they talk about strictly humanitarian points, we are ready to offer what we have to offer. If they don't call us, we just don't push.
Any more questions?
Maybe ICRC can ask a question too.
Yes, questions from both sides. We can have a mediation.
Exactly. We should ask you.
ဓမ္မလိုပဲမိပါတော့မယ် ICRC ရဲ့ရည်မှန်းချက်က အင်မတန်ကိုမွန်မြတ်တယ်ရေးလဲကြီးတယ်ပေါ့နော်ဒီလိုရေးကြီးတဲ့အဖွဲ့အစည်းကို UN ကဘယ်လိုထောက်ပံ့မှုရှိတယ်လဲအဖို့ရေဘယ်လိုဆက်သွယ်ဆက်ဆက်မှုတွေနဲ့များတွားနေလဲပေါ့နော်ဘယ်လို program တွေများရှိပါလဲသိချင်ပါတယ်
I just heard the end of the translation.
Can you repeat the question?
No, that's good. I was translated again.
All right. Okay.
The
Good.
lady.
Good. Yes.
If it's for me, it's okay.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. So, well, as you know, historically, the United Nations were created well after ICRC. ICRC was in the 19th century, as we said. In 1863, and United Nations were created after the Second World War. And it's true that the mission is a bit different. ICRC was created for all the reasons we already explained. United Nations was created, if I remember well, to try to find peaceful resolution to avoid war between nations. So it is two different agenda, and it is two different type of organization. So it is true that we don't have the same mandate, we don't have the same mission, but sometimes we need to work together. Because the United Nations, after the Second World War, they became really big. And they created a lot of organizations. Some organizations for human rights, some organization for the children, UNICEF, some organization for the refugees, HCR, some organization for development, UNDP. So they have a lot of different agencies, and sometimes we work in the same places. If you go to Myanmar, for example, there is a lot of UN agencies, and there is the ICRC, and there is the Red Cross family, and there is a lot of NGOs also. So usually we make three categories to separate. One is the Red Cross family, and it's this family of organizations who try to be independent, neutral and impartial. Then you have the UN system, and for us the UN system, I know that it's a bit sensitive, but we consider it a bit as a political body, because United Nations is a union of nations. So it is the collection of countries who take decision in the General Assembly and in the Security Council. So we think that all the decisions of the UN are political decisions. That is why we don't want to be part of the UN. If we want to stay neutral and independent, we cannot be part of the UN system. Some other organizations like NGOs, they also don't want to be part of the UN system. MSF, ACF, and local NGOs. But the difference with the ICRC is that ICRC has a mandate from the state. We are not an NGO. We have a mission given by the international community. So that is why we do those three divisions: UN system, Red Cross family or Red Crescent family, and NGOs. Maybe just to finish on this, very often we need to coordinate with them. If we work in the same place, we try at least not to overlap, not to do things which are not coherent, or not to do something 2 times instead of 1. So we have a dialogue with all the UN agencies. We sit down with them, we have meeting with them, we try to understand what they do, we say what we do, and then we hope that it is a better collective job. But it's just coordination, it's nothing more. Thank you.
Poponga di ဥပဒေကိုစိတ်ဝင်စားလာတယ်နော်ဟိုအကယ်၍ဒီ ICRC က UN လဲ UN အဖွဲ့အစည်းလဲဟိုအထောက်အကူလဲမယူဘူးဆိုဒီစာအုပ်ထဲမှာပြထားတယ်လို့ဟို NGO အဖွဲ့အစည်းလဲမဟုတ်ဘူးအဲ့လိုဆိုတော့ဟိုအကယ်စစ်ပွဲဖြစ်တဲ့နေရာမှာပဋိပက္ခဖြစ်တဲ့နေရာမှာအဲ့နိုင်ငံအစိုးရကဝင်ခွင့်မပေးဘူးပြဿနာနဲ့တအားရှိနေပြီအဲ့ဒီမျိုးနေရာမှာဟိုကူညီနိုင်ဖို့အတွက်ဘယ်လိုလုပ်ပြီးတော့ဟိုဆက်တွယ်ရမလဲမရအောင်ဟိုတက္ကသိုလ်ဘက်မှာဘယ်လိုစူးစမ်းပြီးတော့ဟိုဝင်ပြီးတော့ကူညီနိုင်မလဲအဲ့ဒါလေးဖုံဖုံသိချင်ပါတယ်
Yes, Well, I can give a beginning of question, and maybe Sylvain, you can add after one, because it's a very important question, of course. Sylvain this morning explained that there is different type of conflicts, and he gave the example of the two biggest categories. Some conflicts are between countries. It's the international conflict. And Sylvain said that for international conflict, there is a lot of rules that the state needs to respect. For the conflict which are inside a country, the non-international armed conflict, the set of rules is much smaller, and that is why the capacity of ICRC to act in an international conflict is usually higher and more respected by the states than when we go inside a country. I know it is a bit technical, but this morning Sylvain said that when it is inside a country, what ICRC can do, we call it's an offer of service. We can offer our service to the different parties to try to help the people in need of humanitarian assistance. But as any offer, an offer can be rejected. And if you look at the map of the world, there is countries where the ICRC offer is fully accepted and fully respected by the government and by the armed groups. You have also other states where they accept only a little part of it, and they want us to work maybe in one place and not in another one. It is a problem for us. And ultimately, there are countries which do not accept at all. And they say, even if I have some problem in my country, I don't want you to come here. We have a number of countries in the world like that. And so, of course, I think the solution for that is not easy, because we cannot force anybody to accept our presence. We can only explain and try to convince. And to do so, sometimes we need the help of other people. We need the help of the government, of other governments. We need the help of the civil society. We need the help of anybody who can plead for humanitarian action to be made. And of course, it's not an easy job. And to be totally honest with you, if the government, for example, of any country says, you do not go there, we do not go. And yeah, but we never give up. We always ask. We always ask until we get it. Sometimes it takes some time, sometimes it's quicker.
Yeah, maybe just to add on this, it's also why the ICRC has a specificity also in the world of international organizations, based on its principles and based on its working modalities. It's always with the aim to have access to those who need help or assistance or protection in armed conflict. Neutrality, we need to be more convincing, explaining that we don't take side in the political debate in a specific country, to show that if we access an area, it's not for political reasons, it's because we want to reach people on humanitarian grounds. Independence also, that's why it's so important for us to remain independent. We are not governed by states, as explained by Stéphane. The board of the ICRC is composed of persons, individual persons acting in their individual capacity, because they have specific expertise, specific experience, but they don't represent any state, any power, any organization. So independence is important, also for the same reasons, because we think that being independent this will help convincing states to give us access to persons in the field. And the last very important principle or rule is the principle of confidentiality. For us, the priority is to have access to the persons in the field, and we will not share publicly what we see in the field. We will bring our assistance. We will have a dialogue with the authorities, with the government, and with non-state armed groups, but we will not share that publicly. That's also a way to convince authorities, governments, and others to give us access to those who are really in need.
I'd like to know, how did ICRC cooperate with the IHL? One is happening to solve regulated and complex. I'd like to know, because I hear as your presentation or speech, I found it two kinds, IHL and ICRC. So how do you cooperate with each other? Yeah, I'd like to know these two, ICRC and IHL. How cooperate with?
Yeah, no, very important question also. The ICRC, we explained that the ICRC has received a mission to go to the field and to help people in armed conflicts. But there is another part of the mission that we didn't mention maybe clearly, is that ICRC was asked by states to promote IHL, to develop maybe IHL. So we have a team in Geneva who is looking at practice, at reality, and trying to identify new humanitarian concerns and trying to propose new rules to address these concerns. So till today, we need to adapt IHL, and this is the ICRC's role, very important. So there is a clear connection between ICRC and IHL, and the ICRC did that since the beginning of its history. The first task that the people who met in 1863 and they decided to create the ICRC, they said, we need to create something. It was not called IHL at that time, but they said rules to protect people in armed conflict, and that was their main task. And today, 150 years ago, ICRC is still doing that, not only promoting existing rules, but also developing new rules to address new problems. So yes, now the big question is well, what we call cyber warfare, the use of computer to attack the enemy, and possible consequences, physical and humanitarian consequences if there is an attack against the enemy. For example, maybe through computer you can control from a distance, you can control a plane and then destroy this plane. Just being on your desk and using a computer. So the question is whether IHL has something to say about that. It's a new technology. The debate is open. There are also new weapons, the use of drones, you know, the use of robots attacking the enemy. Is it allowed or not? And if yes, what are the rules that will apply to the robots? That's a few examples.
On what Sylvain just said, you can see that it's on the one hand it is very legal, IHL, but on the other hand it is raising real human questions. He just gave the example. In the past, when people were in a war, they had to fight a human being against a human being, and you could see your enemy.
Yeah.
Many decades after, you can kill people just being thousands of kilometers from your target. It's a totally different way of doing the war that in the old times. That's why we need also to adapt the rules. Mm-hmm. You were mentioning the robots. It is a philosophical question. Is it possible to create a weapon which will decide itself with artificial intelligence and with facial recognition to kill an enemy? it is a profound religious and philosophical question. Or you always have maybe the need to have a human being behind to take a decision like that. These questions are very precise questions, and all the armies in the world are creating new weapons, are creating new technologies. And ICRC, we have our own army of Sylvain in Geneva, a lot of people like Sylvain, and they are thinking about how can we make rules for that, and then they present them to the states to say, maybe you should put some limits, because if you don't put limits, these things will get completely out of control.
So, so connected with this, if it happens, support is having a new weapon. So I'd like to know what is the role or what is the function of the ICRC at the time?
I'll give this to Sylvain, but I just wanted to add to what Stefan said just now about robots and artificial intelligence. And there's a debate now.
Yeah.
No one's really sure whether robots will be better at following international humanitarian law or humans. Maybe this is a question. It might be better because robots don't have emotions, or not yet. So there's this sort of debate going on. Sorry.
Yeah. So for instance, if there are new weapons, and we have lawyers in Geneva who have a specific expertise on weapons, they will first look at the weapons, how they work, and they will then meet with experts, meet with military people, with commanders, and try to understand why this new weapon appeared, and trying to understand also what are the potential humanitarian impact of this weapon. And based on this, the ICRC did that several times over the last few years. The ICRC will actually convene a conference of states to discuss about this issue and possibly to draft rules, a new convention or treaty to regulate the use of these weapons. So the ICRC did that with the use of mines, for example, because we understand that there is a humanitarian impact. Mines are not only affecting military but also civilians. So here we have a problem. What do we do in order to prevent that? Now the ICRC, for instance, very recently has worked a lot on the nuclear weapon. Is it allowed or not to use nuclear weapon in armed conflict, knowing that this may have a huge impact, and we know that this has huge impact on civilians, civilian population. And so now you have a treaty which has been adopted and which will become progressively part of IHL.
Thank you.
How do you keep the secret information about the conflict, please? If someone or some organization forced to demonstrate this secret news, how do you solve these problems?
You mean the secret aspect?
Secret news or secret informations. Yes.
Secret information. Confidential and secret information. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Just one answer on the legal side, and then on more operation side, we will ask Stefan. On the legal side, very important also to know that there is a specificity with the ICRC. The ICRC is the only organization in the world who was recognized right to not give confidential information to anybody, but specifically to courts, to judges, when judges are looking for evidence like prosecuting war crimes. Someone, let's say a combatant has killed a civilian. There is a prosecution, there is a court working on that. The court cannot ask the ICRC to give information on this case. Why that? Because the ICRC must be able to do its work to reach, again, victims in the field. And if it was perceived as helping courts, probably that he would lose access to the people. So it's very specific to the ICRC. It's not that the ICRC is not against criminal prosecution of those who are responsible, but we need to protect the capacity of the ICRC to do its work in the field.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah.
On the more practical side, it's not everything that is confidential with ICRC. 90% of what we are doing, we can talk about it, we can explain it, and that is what we are doing now. But it is true that when you are in a conflict zone, if you want to reach the people who need your assistance, sometimes you will see and you will hear certain sensitive information. And this sensitive information, if you share it publicly, then you lose the trust of the different parties who are fighting. So, whoops, we had a little accident here. So, that is why we say ICRC is confidential. It's this, we need to be able to protect certain information, because if we make public declaration about everything, we will lose our capacity. I will do it. Thank you. We lose our capacity to access the place. And everybody understands that. That is why we don't have to make, like other organizations, we do not make public accusation. We do not make public reports about violations. When we see a violation, we share the information only with those who are committing the violation. If the army of any country does something wrong, we give the information to the army and we tell them, can you do something about that? If it is an armed group, we share the information with the armed group and we tell them, maybe you need to correct something. But we will not tell to everybody who is doing what. Because if we do that, nobody will accept ICRC anywhere in the world.
If someone paused to demonstrate.
Sorry?
If someone paused or some organizations to demonstrate this secret news, how do you solve it?
So this is what Sylvain was explaining.
Yes.
In general, our organization is the only organization in the world who is protected by law not to share its information.
Yes.
If tomorrow a government, or if tomorrow an organization, or even if tomorrow a judge from a court call ICRC and say, I want your information, we have a possibility to explain that ICRC is protected by law. And it is with all states in the world. So it's a very specific characteristic. It's because we know that we are working in very dangerous and sensitive places, and we need to be careful with the way we use information.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Stephen and Sylvain, for your explanation, and also to Mr. Andrew and Mr. Raman for the additional information. So I think we will move on with our former plan. In the morning, Mr. Sylvain has already introduced about IHL, what is International Humanitarian Law. Now we would like to move further to observe what are the rules and responsibility, so that it would be very helpful to apply in our community and share our understanding with the people. So not taking much of the time, then may I hand over the floor to Mr. Sylvain, please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so indeed we will have a closer look now at the contents of IHL. Both look at the main rules that apply to IHL, but also what is proposed by IHL to improve respect for the rules and to improve promotion of the rules. And as an introduction, so it's a bit blocked here. It's important to understand that IHL is based on two basic core principles, or two fundamental considerations. All the rules are based on the balance between first, the military necessity, and second, humanity. Military necessity means that there is some recognition under IHL that actually violence is used in armed conflicts, and that there is an interest from the belligerents, from the combatants, for the combatants to actually use weapons in order to overpower their enemy. So it's a fact. We have to take this fact into account, but IHL says that only the force which is necessary to reach this goal, which is to win the conflict, basically, can be used. No more than what is necessary. That's the idea of the military necessity. And then the second consideration is humanity, meaning that the limits to the use of violence has to be found in humanity, in the need to ensure some protection for human beings. So let's try now to look more precisely at examples of rules of IHL. As I said, a group of rules are about human treatment, and there is an obligation to give human treatment to people who are detained, who are civilians in an area controlled by a government. They are entitled to human treatment. What does this mean in practice? What is human treatment? What is inhuman treatment? You have a lot of rules giving examples, but here I've quoted Article 3 to the Geneva Conventions, which is the article governing non-international armed conflicts, which says that there is an obligation to not use physical violence or mental violence, whether murder, whether torture, whether cruel treatment against these protected persons. But it's more than that. It's not only violence, but it's also any form of degrading or humiliating treatment, which is prohibited. And for instance, it's prohibited to expose detainees to the public. If you have detainees or prisoners of war, you cannot show them in the street and boasting that you have arrested these people. This would be considered as humiliating treatment, which is prohibited. And of course, there is an obligation to take care of the wounded and sick. Medical care must be provided, again, because these people are not considered as combatant and therefore are entitled to special protection. So this is about human treatment, trying to understand a little bit more what is human under IHL. But then you have a number of rules dealing with the fighting, with the conduct of hostilities. And these rules are mainly aimed at protecting civilians who are caught in the middle of combat operations. Usually you have combatants in a village, and then the enemy attack the village. What happens? The combatants are in the middle of the village, and there are civilians also living in the same place. What can be done to protect actually the civilians? And the first rule here is that the parties, well, the troops in the field, the parties to the conflict must at all times, so no exception, distinguish between the combatants and the civilians, and also between military objectives and civilian objects. The principle of distinction. And therefore there is this rule that only military objectives, only enemy combatants can be targeted. If someone, let's say an attacker, is actually targeting a civilian and killing the civilian, this is considered as a war crime, and this person can be prosecuted for that. No excuse based on the conflict, even though the civilian is maybe part of a community supporting the enemy combatant. There is no right to kill a civilian. That's very clear under IHL. But there is another rule which is sometimes a bit difficult to understand, is that even if the combatant is doing his work, making a distinction between combatants and civilians and targeting only combatants. There is a need to take into account potential risk of casualties for civilians who are around the objective. I give you an example. For example, if a plane actually is arriving in a city and wants to launch a bomb against a military barrack, it's not prohibited by IHL as such, because it's targeting a military barrack, and military barrack is a military objective, so it's not prohibited. But if this barrack is in the middle of a city where you have a lot of civilians living, where you have schools, where you have monasteries, and that can be destroyed with this attack, then you have a problem here, because while attacking the enemy, you will reach also persons who needs to be protected. And here IHL says, well, if there is a, how can I say, an excessive disproportion between what we want to reach, destroying the barrack, and the civilian casualties, you have to stop the attack. Even if it can be in your interest to destroy the barrack, knowing that the civilians will be actually killed or will suffer wounds, or civilian houses will be destroyed, you have to stop the attack. This is the proportionality assessment. And lastly, very important rule also is that there is an obligation for the combatants to take precautions. Meaning that it's not enough to say, okay, I will respect distinction, I will respect the civilians, but you have to make sure of what you're doing. And for that, you have to take precautions. You have to investigate before attacking the enemy to make sure that, for instance, you're really targeting a military objective. Because sometimes there are confusions. You think that you are attacking military truck, but in fact it's a truck driven by, let's say, a farmer. But from a distance, you thought there were military in the truck. In fact, there were civilians. If you don't take measures to verify before launching the attack, you fail to take precaution, and this is a violation of IHL. So precautions when you're attacking is very important, but also precautions when you think that the enemy will attack you. So here you are defending, you have also an obligation to take precautions. You cannot go into a school, for instance, with your military material, with your military people. You cannot settle in the school while there are children in the class. Because if the enemy come, the enemy will have incentive to attack you, and while attacking you, they will also attack the children in the school. So you have to separate the military from the civilian. That's also a precaution that is based on IHL. There's one exception to that, and it's get a bit complicated, but I just want to mention that because it's important today in Myanmar. That's an issue that we are discussing with a number of people in Myanmar. It's also a moral dilemma. So it's important for all of us to be aware of that. What happens when civilians participate in the conflict? Normally, civilians cannot be targeted, they cannot be killed, but what if they take weapons and decide to fight? And here we have to find a balance, because you cannot ask a combatant not to react because it's a civilian who's targeting me, so I have no right to kill this person. No, this is not realistic. So the rule here is that under IHL, civilians are protected against attack, so we know that. They are protected against attack, but there is one exception, which is unless and for such time as they take a direct part in hostilities. So it's a bit legal jargon, but it is that the exception for that You have the right to react if you are attacked by a civilian. As a combatant, you can react, you can even kill the civilian, but in a very limited situation, only when there is a direct participation in hostilities, when the civilian is really acting in a specific combat operation. Okay, in this case, you can defend yourself, basically. But you may have other situations where you have civilians who are kind of helping a group, an armed group, let's say because they want to give finance to the group, or because they want to produce weapons that will be used by the group. Maybe these civilians are useful for the group, but they are not participating in the fighting. It's just like support to the group, but not fighting. These people cannot be killed under IHL. It's prohibited. It's not direct participation, it's indirect support to a group. Maybe I will just open the floor for questions because it's very technical, very complicated. Only direct participation can be, result in the loss of protection, but other forms of support, civilians remain protected against attack. Questions on that, maybe? Or examples that you would like to ask? Because it's very concrete, very precise, it's very case by case that we have to assess whether a civilian loses protection. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. That's a very, very good question, because it's not only taking arms also, or fighting. Fighting is quite easy. You understand that if a civilian attacks you, you're allowed to react. Yeah. But you have another question?
No, I'm not sure my question was heard. That was the only thing. Maybe you could repeat the question.
Okay.
Yeah, or I can repeat the question for the translation. Is you mentioned that civilians are not protected under IHL if they take up arms, if they're actually bearing a weapon. But the terminology here says taking a direct part in hostilities. So how else could one take a direct part that doesn't involve taking up arms?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a very important question. This is an example where ICRC has also contributed to IHL, to better understand IHL. ICRC organized a 5 years expert meeting to answer your question. So it's a very difficult question. We have asked military experts this question, what we mean by direct participation in hostilities. We've asked academics, humanitarians, and so the answer was that if a civilian is part of a global operation attacking the enemy, so it's an operation, fighting operation, it can be targeted if it's contributed to this specific operation, even though it's not actually using a weapon. It can be if the civilian is, for instance, sharing tactical information to those who are going to combat, or those who are currently combating. Giving this type of information while the operation is actually started is participation. So the person is not fighting, but is part of a more general operation, which is actually participation in hostilities.
And were you making a distinction between defense and offense there? You mentioned that in an offensive example, sharing information, but what about in a defensive?
No, IHL doesn't make a difference on defense and offense. It's always about attacks, and an attack can be either in offense or in defense. It's using weapons, whatever the situation. That is a good point. It's also this has been debated too.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, Sylvain knows much more about this, obviously, but in terms of, just war theories, in some, the idea that defense is justifiable, offense is not, according to international law. But according to international humanitarian law, which governs what happens during the conflict, not before, then this is...
You're not covered. You need better insurance.
Yeah. Yeah. So the just on this, the right to self-defense is not IHL, but it's international. There are rules on that. It's about whether it's allowed to use force against another state, basically. Yeah. I will continue. This was about what IHL says in terms of protection of victims of armed conflict, but now I would like to say a few words very rapidly about rules of IHL promoting respect for the rules and also promoting possibly prosecution of those who are responsible for violations. There are the two aspects. And in terms of implementation, how states and also armed groups, but it's mostly states we're talking about here, can actually be prepared to situation of armed conflicts and be prepared to respect IHL in the situation of armed conflict. Those are rules which can be followed at all times. And for instance, the first one is to ratify international treaties of IHL, meaning to accept to be bound by treaties of IHL, because the rule in international law is that states only have to respect rules that they have accepted. So I said that the Geneva Conventions have been accepted by all states. So they are very strong, actually. We can use them in any context. But then the additional protocols that I mentioned also, which are very important, are not accepted by all states. So we cannot use them in some country, including in Myanmar. So important to ratify international treaties. Then important to adopt domestic law. Sometimes you need to adopt internal statutes which will give some more contents to IHL, so some more detail to IHL. One example we have in Myanmar is that Myanmar is currently adopting a law to ensure respect for the Red Cross and Red Crescent emblem. You know that some categories of people are protected, can use this emblem, like the Icrc, but there are others also. The medical services, for instance, can use the flag, white flag with a red cross, and this means that they are protected. They cannot be targeted, attacked when they are in war zones. And for that, states have to adopt a law saying it's prohibited to attack these people, but also to say exactly who is entitled to use the Red Cross in the country. And Myanmar is currently doing that in the parliament. To spread knowledge of IHL, disseminate our IHL, that's something we already mentioned today, very important in order to anticipate respect for IHL. And the last thing I want to mention is the creation of this IHL National Committee. I mentioned that because very recently Myanmar authorities decided to study this question, whether they will create an IHL National Committee. What is that? It's a body of the government which will actually focus on international humanitarian law questions, and which will be composed of any ministry which may have an interest in IHL. So it can be the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Health also has a say in that. But not only ministries, but also any person, experts, organizations who can contribute to better respect for IHL in the country. So it's a very practical tool, but very important because it really helps improving the situation in the country. And I think it's interesting that today there is a formal discussion at government and parliament level in Myanmar in view of possibly having such a committee in the future. Lastly, and we were asked this morning the question of enforcement of IHL. What can be done in terms of in times of armed conflict? When you have an armed conflict, to ensure respect for IHL. And here I will maybe simplify saying that there are two main obligations for states. First is to suppress violation of IHL. So if there is an armed conflict and the authorities know that there was a violation in the field, they have to take measures to stop that. Maybe to investigate and to see what went wrong in the field, why, for instance, a civilian was killed by a military. Was it because lack of precaution? If yes, then we have to take more precautions, maybe investigate more before launching an attack and making more distinction between civilians and combatants. So authorities, commanders have to stop violation of IHL. And second, there is an obligation to prosecute violation of IHL, especially the most serious ones. Like murder is one of the most serious violation of IHL, or torture also is very serious. If there are allegations showing that in a specific context, detainee has been tortured by someone, there is here again obligation to start a criminal investigation to verify whether it's true or not. And if it's true, then an obligation to start a criminal process against the person who is potentially responsible for that. This is also IHL. So IHL is not only about providing rules how to conduct military operations, but it's also about rules, I would say, showing what can be done to improve respect for IHL in the field. It's very important. I think I will stop here my presentation because we need maybe more time for the questions. It really depends. Yeah, okay. So maybe one or two questions from the floor. We had opportunities already to answer some of them. Okay. If not, we can go ahead with the program. Yes?
Earlier you mentioned about when you attack the enemy, you have to make a distinguish the civilian and the army, the enemy. So even you say that sometimes, you know, intentionally they did it, they do it, but at that time, what is your response to the attacker? Because sometimes, you know, they did it intentionally, yeah. But after they, you know, they attack, they said because we don't have enough information, sometimes it can make mistake. Yeah. So when they give accuse this kind of accuse, what is your response to them? Yeah.
Yeah, again, it's really a case by case analysis. It depends on all the circumstances of the case. If it's intentional, if a civilian has been killed intentionally. Here there is not much to say beside that there need to have an investigation to clarify, to verify that, and to start prosecution for any other crime you may have in the country. This is a typical case of criminal act, like even in time of peace you have people killing others. So domestic courts will prosecute this case. Now, if it's not intentional, maybe it's a mistake, we as ICRC, we can discuss about measures to take in order to prevent this kind of event. And measures that have to be taken are usually precautionary measures. What can be the next time to avoid this situation can be choosing better weapons, more precise weapons, because usually when a civilian is killed, it's because weapons are not precise enough. They destroy a whole village, and in the village you have military and civilians. So you cannot do that. You have to use weapons who can be targeted on military objective and separate civilians. Yeah, I think that's and also the fact that it was not intentional can in a process, in a criminal process, can also be taken into account as a mitigating measure in terms of sanction. Maybe if it's not intentional, the person will be sanctioned, but not as heavily than the one who really wanted to kill a civilian. That's how I see things.
Yeah, this is very difficult case. Yeah, thank you. And yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, just as a complement to what was said by Sylvain, if in any army of the world or in any armed group, if something wrong is done, Sylvain made clear that there is one part which is the investigation, and if the investigation shows that something wrong was done, there should be a sanction or a punishment or a sentence. This is for any armed group or any army in the world. They should have a way to investigate and to punish if it is necessary. But it is true that in the reality, it is more complex than that. Because sometimes some violations take place because the army is not well prepared, is not well equipped, is not well informed, or has a certain mentality of resentment against the enemy. And for this, it is not only a question of accountability, investigation, and decision of justice, it is also a question of how can you modernize the armed forces or the armed group. And any army or any armed group, if they want to reduce the violence and the possibility or the potential violation, they should also think on how to better train, how to better educate their soldier, how to better share this knowledge with them. It is another obligation. It is not only about justice and tribunal, it is also about preparing your soldiers to reduce the risk of a violation to the maximum. And that is the two sides where ICRC is working. We work for the prevention, for the future, to try to minimize the risk. And if something wrong is being done, or if there is information about that, we share it with the armed group to tell them that maybe they should do an investigation. Two sides.
Does not have like an executive power for just doing prosecution.
I can repeat what you say, Ramin. What Ramin says is very true as well, is that ICRC has no power to enforce that. We are not a tribunal. We are not judges. We are not an organization who can make an investigation. We can only hear a problem. We call it an allegation from the population. And if this allegation looks or sounds serious, we give it to the armed group and we say, you need to do an investigation. ICRC is not an organization of meant for investigating or to decide on judicial processes.
So this is our joint presentation, looking at the interface between Buddhism and IHL. So this is where I'm sure you will become awake, and and hopefully, you know, so with little moha left, and so So it's a joint presentation. Therefore, Andrew will start introducing a little bit of background on the project that he and the team in Sri Lanka and also in the UK and other parts of the world are actually looking at the connection between IHL and Buddhism, and how Buddhism as well as Buddhist studies can actually kind of contribute, and also how there's a dialogue between Buddhism and IHL. So I will hand over to Andrew. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. P. What Dr. P didn't mention was that she has also been very much involved with this project over the last 2 years, whilst she's been shuttling between here and the UK. So very many thanks to her. And that has also made it much easier to arrange this event today. So thank you very much. That was a good coincidence. And also, Professor Asanga Tilakaratna, who will be speaking after this presentation, has been very much involved as well, has been a very great support to us. What myself and Dr. P will do now is to lay the foundations, introduce a little bit the subject, and Professor Asanga Tilakaratna will take it further in his presentation. But we will just touch upon a few points to get the conversation started. Oh, sorry.
Hold on. Good.
Not the great start.
Yes.
Which one is it? It's okay, down. Yeah, so I won't dwell very much on this introduction, but just to say that, of course, that armed conflict is nothing new. IHL, as we've heard this morning, has been established to try to tackle this. But IHL is not always well known, and many people, of course, are much more familiar with their religious and cultural and philosophical traditions, and this is something that we try to take into account. At the same time, IHL is itself a legacy of customary law, which Sylvain was talking about earlier, of many different religious and philosophical traditions. It's a product of that to a large degree. So we try to encourage research and debate on correspondences between different religions and IHL, and to see where the correspondences are, where the differences are, and to see how the message might perhaps reinforce each other. As was mentioned earlier, we've been engaging with religious circles, religious leaders, scholars, universities, colleges, etc., for a number of years now, in different parts of the world. In the Islamic world, we've been increasingly now in the Buddhist world, with Hindu circles, with Christian circles. So by doing this, we hope to find, to create some mutual understanding, find some common ground, and also to learn from other religious and philosophical traditions, to see that how we can enrich our own work, to see how we can enrich IHL. Sylvain's already said that IHL is always developing. It always has to adapt, and we can learn from you in terms of that process. And over the last, another thing is that a lot of this engagement can also help us with our operations and can also help us to do our work better. And this has been talked about a little bit this morning. So over the last 2 to 3 years, we've increased our engagement with Buddhist circles. We've done a lot of work, as P was saying, in London and Sri Lanka and other parts of the world. We've concentrated first on the Theravada Buddhist world, on the Pali canon, but increasingly now it's expanding into the Mahayana Buddhist world, into the Vajrayana Buddhist world, Zen Buddhism, etc. Why religious circles? Again, I think we've already touched upon this. Religious leaders like yourselves are well respected in your communities. You're involved in humanitarian action, charity work, working for your communities. You're very well connected. You're in a position to advise many different people, to support assistance and protection of victims of conflict, etc. You're involved very much in education. That's why we're here at SSBU today. And it's collaborations with universities like this that really make our work a lot easier and enable us to embark on research projects and outreach so that we can better promote IHL, but also so we can encourage further study of the relevant aspects of Buddhism. So we've engaged around the world with many universities, monk and lay scholars, humanitarian organizations. We've also engaged with militaries now in some Buddhist contexts. This is something that's starting. There's a lot of interest from some military people in some of the work, and with Buddhist chaplains. For example, there's Buddhist chaplains even in the US and the UK militaries that we've engaged with. As P mentioned, in September last year, we arranged a 3-day international conference on Buddhism and IHL, and all of this is still very exploratory. We're still learning, and we would very much appreciate your feedback and your support and your advice, because we're just starting this. So you may have some critical feedback, which we would very much appreciate. But so far, it was the first conference of its kind. It has presented some groundbreaking research in Buddhist studies, in Buddhist ethics. We are now working on a book which will be published with many top Buddhist scholars. And a lot of people are now wanting to do research on this subject, do their PhDs. And it's highlighted how relevant Buddhist concepts, principles, and also meditation technologies, mindfulness techniques are for armed conflict. And we will be arranging a follow-up conference in December in Chiang Mai in Thailand, and that's another thing I wanted to put on your radar. There were some lead questions for the conference, and here I think I'll let P take over perhaps. Basically, some of the questions we asked were, what are the correspondences between Buddhist ethics and IHL? Which Buddhist teachings and traditions are most relevant to IHL and situations of armed conflict? What level of agreement and commitment for IHL can be expected from Buddhist communities? And what practical guidance and resources can Buddhist teaching and practice provide to those who are in armed conflict situations? Dr. P.
So those were the questions that the scholars and the participants explored at the conference. But these questions still, we would like to explore it here as well. And so we would actually welcome your thoughts and feedback on these questions. But one kind of key concept that's relevant to the discussion here is about compassion, and we actually started with compassionate meditation this morning, just at the opening ceremony, and the key idea here is that compassion for all sides in a conflict, especially not just one's own, but also the enemy. I think this idea is very crucial. If we call it, now when we look at the international humanitarian law, humanitarian as in Kojin Sade. So the idea of compassion actually applies not only to my country or my community, but also to others' communities and other nations. So it's a key foundation, and this idea of compassion, when we look at it closely, it's one of the key elements is impartiality. So if there's a conflict between me and another person, this is at the individual level, then if we have a compassionate approach, then we have to be impartial. And this is pretty much what we have been hearing about ICRC and IHL and the whole organization is trying to do. Another key idea here is, again, in terms of how the use of deadly force. And as we all know, the first precept is about non-violence, okay? And this applies to monastics, so members of the Sangha and the lay people. And this idea is a very crucial one as well. But one of the things that I have mentioned in my opening remarks, and also various people in the room have already mentioned, is that we have to accept the reality. The reality is that there are armed conflicts, and with that regard, if we look at karmic theory or the theory of karma in Buddhism or Buddhist ethics, then we have to actually accept and explore what are the karmic consequences, karma and vipaka, what are the consequences of killing. So that is also a very important area for research, not just for the individual combatants, but also for civilians as well as other communities who are actually kind of got entangled in the armed conflict situation. And then we then have to look after, again, based on compassionate approach, care for the injured and protect those who are caught up in the armed violence. How can we best manage, or how can we best help these vulnerable peoples? And again, in terms of from Buddhist point of view, we then have to look at the kind of, even for the treatment of prisoner and things like that. What are the Buddhist concepts and teachings that can we draw on in order to cover these areas? Okay, so one of the points, as I mentioned here, is to encourage the study and also the research into these areas. And then we then come to the idea about self-control and responsibility and self-discipline. And as we all know from Vinaya and the 5 precepts and for the nuns 8 or 10 precepts, we all know that self-discipline and self-control is very important, which means that it's not only just applicable to us, but also for military, so military personnel. as well as other parties, those who are involved in the armed conflict. And we all can kind of, nowadays, mindfulness or meditation has been used in the context of military and training military personnel. And our Rathasyaro usually kind of mention something about the contribution that mindfulness movement and meditation has been making. And again, so this is very kind of another important area and relevant, very much relevant to our discussion here. Another one that I would like to mention is related to the one of the precepts. The third precept this is about sexual mixed conduct. So in an armed conflict situation, usually there are evidence that sexual violence being kind of perpetrated, and so what are the kind of Buddhist concepts and Buddhist teachings that can we draw on in order to kind of deal with this issue? Another one is protection and of property. So what we are talking about is the livelihood of the communities, those are involved in these armed conflict situations. So in that regard, again, this is very important issues. Another one is about environment and the damage that we do to animals and crops and so on. This one is also important in the sense that one of, as you may have noticed, one of the kind of Facebook posts that coming up on our Rathasyara's page is about how best we can help the country through economic means in order to have a peaceful nation. So this idea actually ties in nicely with what Dr. Dhammasami has been kind of saying and giving in the Dhamma talk. So those are the key concepts. Another one that I briefly want to mention is in terms of, again, talking about the development and governmental issues. So the idea about government. But in Buddhist tradition, we have the idea about Chakawati, Sajawari in Myanmar, and he has he has the military. We all know that, but this is used in a measured way in order to protect and defend. So another one is related to ethics. I won't go into very much detail about that because we already mentioned it. So I'm just going to now hand over to Andrew to explain a little bit more about the findings that came out from the conference.
Thank you very much, Dr. P. And so what Dr. P was going through there was how the working group of Buddhist scholars and ICRC staff conceptualized, or tried to conceptualize the relationship between Buddhism and IHL, breaking it down into the topics that P has described as being the areas of Buddhist studies that are most relevant. And so now I'm going to just very briefly and not very expertly touch upon a few things that came up, and Dr. P will correct me or add to what I have to say if necessary. So I think the first thing that came out was that there's often a conception that Buddhism is, a very peaceful religion, but it sort of ignores the fact that Buddhism has always dealt with the reality of war, as Dr. P has already said. And if you look at the Buddhist texts, you can find a very radical and hard-hitting analysis, not only of the causes of conflict, but also of the dynamics at work within conflict. Another point is that while Buddhism never condones war, and there is no just war theory in Buddhism, it does acknowledge the reality and the suffering it causes. Another very important point is that Buddhism has a very pragmatic approach to conflict, as does IHL, we believe. The Buddha himself lived in a time of conflict. He advised rulers that were involved in wars. He did not tell the kings of his time to disband, to get rid of their armies. Yeah, he even ruled that serving soldiers should not be allowed to join the Sangha, because some of the kings complained that their soldiers were becoming monks, so he prohibited this. So he had adopted a very pragmatic approach, it seems. And because the key principle of Buddhism is non-violence, and violence is seen to bring bad karmic results, as Dr. P has already said, Buddhist combatants themselves, Buddhist fighters, have a strong motive to limit the effects of their military violence in accord with IHL principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, some of the things that Sylvain was talking about earlier. You may disagree. This is some of the things that came out. So both Buddhism and IHL aim to minimize harm and suffering. Buddhism at all times, IHL only during armed conflict. And there's some wonderful stories from the Buddhist scriptures, one of which is probably better told by P. About the Buddha admiring God Saka, who was fighting a war. And he was so conscious of the need to minimize suffering that he made sure that his chariots didn't disturb the birds' nests and kill the birds during the conflict. So this is a sort of an illustration of the very impressive steps that that Buddhism advocates for. So for a combatant, as Dr. P has said, there will be some breaking of the first Buddhist precept probably, not to kill. Yeah, but the damage should be minimized as far as possible, using means that are proportional, and only focusing on military objects, and taking as many precautions as possible. One thing that Professor Asanga will go into in a lot more detail is that we have to differentiate between the expectations of the Sangha, of the monastics, and of lay people. There's a different level that's expected in terms of adherence to certain precepts. So I will not say more on that, but it's a very important distinction we need to make. So people have to choose how that they deal with these karmic consequences according to who they are and what they do and what their situation is.
And also, if I could just add briefly about this, in that when we look at the idea of cetana or intention, then usually the military personnel, they also want to protect their own soldiers, and also to protect their own communities as well. And so can you see that there's a kind of a nuanced understanding of cetana, and that comes into when they are making the decision. So on the one hand, yes, they would like to win the war, as it were. But on the other hand, they would also need to protect their own soldiers, their own community, and so on. So it's a very tricky situation. And when we kind of assess any situation, those are the kind of things that we probably need to look into detail and do more research on. Okay. Yeah.
Another very important similarity with IHL is the idea of individual responsibility. We're responsible for our own karma. So this is a very important element. And one thing that's very striking to me as a non-Buddhist who's learning about this subject is this idea that ethics are a skill in Buddhism. And correct me if I'm wrong. There's the concepts of skillful, kusala, and akusala, unskillful behavior. And that's, everyone is responsible for dealing with that, for managing that in some way. And it's rather similar to the balance that we talk about in IHL, where you have to make the choice. Buddhists have to make this choice, just as according to IHL, people have to make a choice according to the situation. Dr. P has already mentioned the duties of a righteous ruler, a wheel-turning monarch, a Chakravarti ruler, during armed conflict. In fact, in many ways, it seems that Buddhism laid very early foundations for international law. The Sangha was the first international organization. And of course, we have historical examples of great Buddhist kings, Ashoka in India, Dutugamanu in Sri Lanka, etc. Another important aspect to look at is right livelihood, also during armed conflict. And one very interesting thing in Buddhism is that there is a prohibition on the arms trade, for example. So this is interesting. The Jataka stories, which are within the Pali canon, they're canonical texts, as you know much better than me, I'm speaking for my fellow ICRC staff. They contain many stories about the Buddha's past lives. And in some of these past lives, the Buddha was an advisor to kings, or he was even a military commander. And there's stories of how, in these past lives, the Buddha dealt with these conflict situations. They're almost like IHL case studies. Yeah. And so basically these Jataka stories contain a core of ethical principles that relate to war and have convergence with those underlying IHL, and contain aspects of the Buddhist ethical vision related to the conduct of war. We've already mentioned the Buddhist psychological insights. Buddhism has paid much attention to the causes of conflict at both the personal and the collective level. In the light of human psychology, Buddhism accepts that conflict is almost inevitable, and that skillful and unskillful mental states are rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. And perhaps Peter Harvey, a Buddhist scholar who's been working with us in the UK, he stated that Buddhism's analysis of the psychological realities of the human condition is arguably its greatest potential contribution to enhancing interpretations of IHL and reducing suffering during armed conflict. We do have gaps to fill. The project is only starting. So we're really keen to get as much support and advice from SSBU and from monks like yourselves as possible. We need to do more research into the Vinaya, the monastic code, more research into Abhidhamma, Buddhist psychology, and I know that Dr. P is particularly strong on this. More work on the environmental dimension of armed conflict. On the management of the dead, we're going to commission some research in Sri Lanka, perhaps here as well, on management of the dead according to Buddhism with the forensics department of ICRC. And the benefit of right mindfulness during armed conflict for military or affected communities. And now we hope you have some questions. And maybe Dr. P wants to say something.
No, questions. Any questions? Welcome.
My name is Venerable Dr. Pandawa. I want to know what's of Buddha previous life, what commander, army commander, what kind of activity did, what did he did to deal with conflicts.
And I didn't quite catch it. The army commander meaning.
Yeah, what when the Buddha army commander, what did he did to solve the problem?
Okay, this is something that I have to hand over to. I mean, there's a number of in the Jataka stories. There's a number of examples of siege warfare and all of this. So we hand over to the experts now.
No, that's okay. I think the meaning of that reference was Venerable. Of course, there are so many stories, but to show that the whole phenomenon of warfare was not very much away from the Buddha's previous life. Buddha has dealt with that. So that was the point from these stories. Of course, he has dealt with in a different manner, advised the kings and very often the minimize. But the important point is he has been within the war. Then how to do that? I think that was the main point in the reference to the Bodhisattva in the Jataka stories. Yeah. Of course, we can go into story by story, but that of course is not the time to do that. Yeah.
Actually, I know it, but I want you to explain to people. For example, Mahosada he negotiated two countries to be united like that. That is the attitude of Buddhists about one world. Like also, one monk have complete among the Sangha members because they are very rude. So sometimes complete occur because rule. So different rule, not just it in there. Sometimes also because resource sharing. Sometimes maybe about ideology, they complete. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I mean the thing is we one of the examples that came into my mind when you asked that question was Mahosada. So Mahosada Phaya Alang. So he was very skilled. And we can see, I remember reading so many stories of his skillful handling of various situations. So there are, like Professor Asanga said, there are various cases that we can go into and look and how he tried to resolve or deal with certain situation in order to reduce the suffering. But what these stories illustrate is that he was compassionate, but also he didn't shy away from these situations. And that's our main point, which is that usually Buddhism has this reputation of being compassionate. Yes, it is, but we also acknowledge the reality, and this kind of trying to deal with the suffering is a major part of Buddhist teaching, and we have to acknowledge that, and we have to accept that. Okay.
Thank you for your good answer.
I might just add that we, in preparation for the conference in Sri Lanka, we collaborated with a number of Buddhist scholars, including Professor Asanga and Dr. P, and people like Peter Harvey and Liz Harris and other Mahinda Digale and other scholars, to produce a position paper where we look at some of these things, and a lot of these stories are mentioned, are referenced. And if you just Google Buddhism and IHL, you'll see our website come up, and you can download the papers. And of course, we will be producing now. We're now actually working through the articles that have been produced for the book. So this is in process, but already we have a paper which contains some material. Any other question?
Hello, my name is Buddha. I'd like to know the main things to stop the to regulate the conflicts according to the Buddhist psychological insight. Can you show me, give an example of what is the main points and what are the main things to solve these problems or to regulate and conflicts, please?
Well, I'll make a start. I'll make an attempt, but then I'll hand over to the experts. I mean, some of the things that we've touched upon are the use of meditation and mindfulness techniques. For example, by the military or by fighters. And the idea that if fighters are more self-aware and they're trained through these techniques to be more calm and mindful in very high stress conflict situations, then it might make it easier for them to make very quick decisions in the battlefield, where you have to decide in 1 second whether you're going to target that person. You're not sure if it's a combatant or a non-combatant. Yeah. Or where fighters may understandably become angry because their fellow soldiers have been killed or their families have been killed, so they want to take revenge. And this might lead to violations of IHL. So apart from just teaching IHL or teaching the rules, which is very important, that came out strongly in the conference, how can we help people to follow the rules? How we can support them? And a lot of this has to do with training before the battle, before they actually go to the battlefield. And there was one very interesting paper at the conference by Dr. Noel True, who is a former US Army psychologist, now working for the British Red Cross, also a Zen Buddhist. And he looked at the use of koan practice in terms of targeting, how it can be, if it's combined with the precepts, with the principles, which is absolutely essential, it can help in this respect. So we're only just starting to look at this. It's a very early days, but that's some of the things. I'll maybe hand over to Dr. P or Professor Sang if they want to add something.
Another additional point that I like to make is, so if army personnel, if they are compassionate and in high stress situation like armed conflicts and battlefield, then if they have this, it's very easy to lose compassion, basically, because your actions and intentions, they are coming from dosa, so hatred and moha as well, of course. So in that situation, it's very easy to lose compassion. And so by having compassion, then the hope is that they would have a self-restraint or self-control in terms of making decision. And those who, are away from battlefield, but also kind of making decision, it's also very important for them to have a compassionate approach. And which means that Buddhism talks about conditionally all the time, like in Patana, for example. And there are multiple conditions. And the hope is that these decision maker would have compassion so that they can take various conditions into account when they are making decision, so that how we could minimize the damage, the harm. Okay, and that's another thing. And also another thing is how to help those who being kind of injured and also who have become distressed because of war. And compassion also, again, very important, especially when if you're dealing with people from the other side, right? So, and ကိုချင်းစာနာမှု လူသားချင်းကိုချင်းစာနာမှု this idea is very crucial, and this idea actually come from Karuna, right? Yeah. So yes.
So is this possible or useful for a terrorist to use this way to regulate the end conflicts, especially for terrorists? Is this useful or possible? I'd like to know, please.
We're very careful in ICRC that we don't use the word terrorist normally, because we have to stay neutral. That's not to say that we condone terrorism, we do not, but we just don't want to, you know, there's sometimes some disagreement on who's a terrorist and who's not. I think you raise a very good point. One thing that comes out very strongly from this work is that its application goes beyond Buddhism. We can see already that Buddhism has so many resources, such advanced concepts, such deep insight into human psychology, that it's applicable beyond Buddhism to non-state armed groups, some of which may be labeled terrorists for good reason or not. Yeah, and you know, so it could be, I mean, this kind of training, this kind of awareness, these kind of principles are applicable, I would argue, potentially to anybody, particularly those people who are most involved in using violence. So that's my idea, but people may disagree.
Thank you.
Sorry, we must have time for the question at the front. I'm aware I'm hogging the microphone today. I will not be here tomorrow, so you have to listen to me talk. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting to hear those results coming out of Dambulla. That's really, really useful. I'd just like to highlight or bring people's attention to one point, is that Buddhism is something that is embedded in many different types of power structures within the world. And it's fantastic if Buddhist organizations with international influence can come out and make some of these positive statements about reducing suffering. But this is only one side of Buddhism, and I think in this room we're all on the same page. Throughout history, the last 1500 years, there have been many, many Buddhist holy wars, and many of the terms that have been put up on the screen have been interpreted in a very different way, as a justification for war, in fact. Ideas of non-self interconnectedness means that it's not such a big deal to kill someone. In Zen, shunyata, meaning that actually there's less degree of personalization and individualization. So again, there's not so much room for kind of independent thinking. You just carry out orders. So one is just to say it's really just an appreciation of how really important it is that people with international influence come out against these kinds of interpretations of Buddhism. So just thank you. Oh, and there's some really good books if people are interested on that topic. Called one is called Zen at War by Brian Victoria, and the other one is called Buddhist Warfare by Michael Jerison.
Thanks very much, Patrick. I mean, indeed, I mean, whenever we're dealing with world affairs, this is the case, and I don't think that Buddhism is any different from any other religion or philosophy in this respect. Yeah, there are always going to be people and power structures who will use these things for their own purposes. So this is par for the course. This is what we're used to dealing with, and it's not unique in any way to Buddhism. We don't like to shy away from these difficult questions. You know, we are aware of Brian Victoria's work and these, you know, and this came up a little bit in Sri Lanka as well, and the potential for this. And I think this is exactly why, as you say, it's good to have this kind of debate, because there's, you know, that's the goal. You know, we're not, we want to learn, we want to encourage debate, and not everyone has to agree. That would be very boring. And it'd be pointless doing these kinds of events. So yeah, I mean, I've fully taken on board, and we're not going to shy away from that, and we're going to, you know, the certain things. Professor, did you want to say something?
Just I thought that question is very interesting. Particularly, you refer to Brian Victoria and, you know, some other work. Interestingly, if you look at Brian Victoria very carefully, Brian Victoria is basically pretty much discussing the Japanese experience, and also how in the Second World War and even before, how the Japanese Buddhist monks incorporated to be national. They were trying to incorporate and reinterpret certain Buddhist teachings to support Japanese Buddhists going to war. But you see, I think there are different strands. So here, certain Buddhist group try to justify participation in the war based on the Buddhist you know, the ideas. Whether we want to call this, of course, I wouldn't agree to say that. Of course, that is one occasion, one historical moment. This is how they interpreted, or they try to justify, or they try to be national in that particular context. However, to interpret such a thing as the Buddhist, I'm not saying that you are doing that, but that would be really problematic. Now, when you look at the Buddhism at war, it is very interesting. Of course, I am not an expert in the entire history over the whole world, but Buddhists have been very often, or almost 99%, they have been aggressive to each other within Buddhism. But they have not gone to warfare with other religions, so, you know, something like that. Actually, I can give you a good reference. There is a Jesuit priest, Indian priest, who wrote interesting paper on Buddhist communalism, Noel Seth, N-O-E-L, Noel, S-C-T-H, Seth, his last name. So one day we met in this kind of conference. He gave me his copy of this paper. So I took it to my room in the evening. I read it over. And then it's very interesting. He records all these Buddhist, you know, the fightings. And then next day morning when I met him, I said, Father Noel is very interesting, but all these are Buddhist fighting with Buddhist, but not Buddhist fighting with anybody else. Because, you know, these intersectarian conflicts, and not necessarily they were killing or anything, but they had animosities, they had heated debates, and, you know, things like that. So you see, this has to be taken. Of course, I'm again, as Andrew correctly said, no need of shying away. If things happen, those things have happened. If those things have happened in the name of Buddhism, of course, it's important to see how what kind of reasoning people have been used. So this is one historical, contextual aspect. But at the same time, it is important to look at what we consider to be the basic discourses of the Buddha, and, you know, what is the kind of, you know, the basic theoretical understanding. Okay, I will be talking about this a little bit more also my presentation.
Just to add one point, I think is in our concept paper, it also came out as well. So at one level, we can talk about the ideal Buddhist ideals and so forth from a theoretical point of view and so on. Another And then we also have to look at the practice in terms of Buddhist ethics, or even in whether Buddhist countries have gone to war and so forth. So it's about this differentiation, and you know, how much can we differentiate, to what extent, and how. And also in relation to talking about the power structure. So like Professor Asanga said, not just the Buddhism, but within Buddhism or Theravada Buddhist tradition and literature and so forth, we also have to have look and take into account of, okay, according to canon, this is what it is, and then according to this and this. So you see, the whole range of issues and spectrum that we have to take into account. So I hope this, the work that we are doing, this is what, you know, kind of covering a range of bases, but we can't, of course, cover all the possible, you know, kind of permutations of events. Okay, question.
I'm Jodika from SSPU. Can I ask in Burmese? Actually, I'm not asked the question. I wanted some suggestions about the Buddhism and IHL. Gera Buddha Badaga Pokuga Digam Hobu Spadu Buddha Bada Da label the Adigam Hopajana Daga Buddha Bada Daga Christian Diaga Digam Hobu Digaga Poku the Ujima Shide doing Sig Daddy Diga Chinyona. So in my conflict on the Sipwari Chid. So in Sipwari and Namu level Nakusan Zaluya. The Kua, how be D Sipwari, Belu Jang Pilara le, Letty Pisoba, sorry, a Letty Chinima bono, Daga the Ku. Dita Bobijo, Nenelli, Sinzame Sui. Luria Tandama, this is where you people are a Jang body. So I love you. Na sen out do Buddha Badaga emphasize load. A boy and ho to the pain. A twin by Lila Meso, you know, a beat him out. Prospect Babu do. Dago the Pueria of Mayao Bono, Pue Bonzo, organization Bonzo, a Kono Nale would do. Hobby, let's see, piece man problem she there. Daga the cookie symbol. Now that touch is a deeper situation at the city. So, Ada Muri Tiba Pana, you know, the game will let we jam, Omni Melu, you say. That had the cook, no? So, Jesus Bari. I guess I go in Mego to Kua. I don't know but the Lugo, Bari Mialu Tarashi.
We are working on those aspects. So that's why we mentioned, you know, research into Abhidhamma. So like you mentioned, I agreed. So we have to have a deeper understanding of what are the causes for armed conflict, causes of armed conflict. And at one level, like you mentioned, that we can look at social or historical, economic conditions or causes. But at the same time, it would be very interesting, and actually now that you're a Abhidhamma teacher, you can do research on it.
No, I mean, thank you very much. Absolutely. We need all the help we can get. In fact, I was trying to push Dr. P to write a paper on Abhidhamma, but she was too busy. So absolutely. And I think what you mentioned, what Dr. P mentioned about the very deep understanding that Buddhism has about the sources of conflict. 2,600 years ago, the Buddha identified poverty And Asanga can say on the poverty as a cause of conflict. You know, the duty of the ruler to ensure a degree of what's the right word? A degree of distribution of resources. Yeah, that would so that these inequalities would not lead to conflict. So I fully agree.
While appreciating Venderable's question, I would like to, very small comment, as Venerable Dr. P. Pocho mentioned, there are historical, social, and economic and all these conditions. The only issue is when you really put the whole weight on psychological condition, you are at the danger of overlooking ground realities. I think the Buddhist approach has to be a balance between, of course, ultimately it is mind. But if we go directly to the mind and ignoring all the other factors, I think what the organization like Red Cross are doing is more like looking after the very important other factors. Of course, ultimately it is mind, it is true. But we should not lose sight of total picture. I mean, that's all. Appreciating your question.
We can maybe take one more question, and I think this, yeah.
I found that many teenagers, after they finish their high school, then many of us with no choice that we have to join the army training in our country. So if let's say the army is compassion, if there's a war, but let's say I don't shoot, so what will happen to me if I don't carry out my duty? Because last vacation I met some friends from other country. They were everyone compulsory to join the army training. So what she did, she just fly away, come to Myanmar for meditate, so to try to escape, but probably there's no way when she go back to the country to have to take up the training. Another friend, she joined the army as the government requested, and then she became an officer and teach the newcomer how to shoot and all that training. So there's my question. If I have compassion, let's say she practices meditation and she's aware of that, and she doesn't want to carry the duty, no shoot. So what will happen?
You start.
Okay, please very kindly let me let me start with this one. I mean, exactly. I think that's Stefan's just given you the answer. This actually is a very interesting question, and this came up in our discussions when we were planning the conference. It was actually mentioned in our position paper as a what if, a combatant is compelled to follow orders. Yeah, to what extent can they decide not to? Yeah, because under IHL, and I'm, Sylvan's sitting behind you. He'll correct me if I say something wrong. You're not supposed to follow unlawful orders. To commit war crimes. It's not. You're supposed to refuse. And in Buddhism, we talked about karma and how to manage that. So I don't have a straight answer to your question, but I would say that we've acknowledged the complexity and the power structures and everything, and this has to be factored in. But I will hand, maybe, Professor, do you want to say something on that?
That's again a very challenging question. I think I will be anyway looking at the philosophical aspect of this question a little bit later. But the very fact that we are going to war, and then the fact that there are organizations like Icrc is to minimize and also avoid unnecessary. So, these adjectives are very important, because the very fact that we are going to, we have accepted the ultimate shooting as a possibility, right? And then also the very idea that we are minimizing means, again, we have left some room for that. So therefore, if you are a soldier, if that is absolutely necessary, you have to shoot, I think. But then what is the Buddhist karmic thing? Yes, according to Buddhist karmic thing, that's what the best of the things to do. But then if you don't want to do that, become a monk and go to forest. But if you are in the society, no, I mean, this is a hard reality. We have to choose one between the other. Now, whole point of whole philosophy of, I think, ICRC is we are choosing less bad. We are trying to minimize it. But you can't get rid of. I mean, if you can get rid of completely 100%, fine. You know, that will be a beautiful world. But anyway.
Just one quick comment is that, yes, following on from Professor Ansanga's point, the IHL and IHL mandate, as it were, is to reduce suffering. So let's think about in a combat situation where if you have yes, you have compassion and then you've been kind of meditating, then you have to decide between distinction. So this idea of distinction between civilian and the military personnel, that also comes into the play. So the point about, okay, say, to use it crudely, if you are a soldier and if you meditate, then the point is, hopefully, you would be able to kind of differentiate and distinguish between, right? So that will be the reality. And that's where, in terms of when we are dealing with idealized situation and the reality that we have to face, we have to kind of take those into account. Otherwise, it's a little bit, discussion and debates and all kinds of things wouldn't actually happen, and then that would not be beneficial. Okay.
Thank you. I think we'll need to wrap up. Is there maybe just one very quick question, and then I mean we're okay for time, by the way, because we've pushed everything back. So but the last question.
Okay. Today's discussion, all of we emphasizes compassion, loving kindness. I want to give a comment. I think we have to establish humans' value awareness and family separate awareness. It's I think, for good hospitality. Okay, understand? ပြောချင်တာမေတ္တာကရုဏာဖြစ်ဖို့ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်လူသားတယောက်ရဲ့လူသားတွေရဲ့တန်ဖိုးကိုနားလည်အောင် awareness လုပ်ပေးဖို့မိသားစုဝင်တွေရဲ့တယောက်နဲ့တယောက်တန်ဖိုးထားတဲ့ family spirit ကို awareness လုပ်ပေးဖို့ကအခြေခံပို့ကြမယ်လို့ယူဆပါတယ်ဒါမှမေတ္တာဆိုတာကရုဏာဆိုတာပေါ်ပေါက်လာပါလိမ့်မယ်
Thank you very much for that question. I'll just say 2 words on that and maybe hand over to Pio. I would say that what you mentioned, the common humanity and family, we're all one family. We talk about the cycle of rebirths. Yeah, we're all related to each other. We're all related to all of the animals and the birds and the plants and the trees, and we're all interconnected. And so this chimes very much with the concept of humanity, which is central to the work of the ICRC and absolutely central to IHL. And I think sometimes it sounds, common humanity. It sounds rather trite, it's obvious. But in our experience, it's not. It's absolutely core. It's an absolutely core value. It's absolutely crucial. So we talk to a lot of different armed groups and some quite radical and difficult groups to deal with. But one thing most of them agree on, almost all of them, is this common humanity, and that's where we can engage with almost anybody, obviously, as can you.
တင်ပါတင်ပါမှန်ပါတင်ပါတင်ပါif I could just answer in Burmese မှန်ပါဗျာတပည့်တော်တို့ဒီဟိုမေတ္တာကရုဏာဆိုတာဟိုတပည့်တော်တို့သုံးတဲ့ဟာကအသုံးနှုန်းနဲ့ဒါသုံးသွားတာပေါ့အဲ့ဒီ concept တွေထဲမှာဘာတွေပါသွားလဲဆိုတော့လူသားချင်းစာနာတာဒါပေမဲ့နောက်တစ်ခုကဘုံပြောတဲ့ဒီမိသားစုထဲမှာရှိတဲ့ value တွေအဲ့ဒါမျိုးတွေကအစဘာဖြစ်လို့လဲဆိုမိသားစုမပြောပါနဲ့ဗျာတပည့်တော်တို့ကိုမချစ်နိုင်ဘူးဆိုရင်တော့မေတ္တာမထားနိုင်ဘူးဆိုရင်သူများကိုမျက်နှာထားဖို့တော့တော်ပြီလေဝေးပြီမလားဗျာအဲ့တော့တပည့်တော်တို့ဒီအခု discussion တွေမှာပြောနေတဲ့မေတ္တာကရုဏာမုဒိတာဥပေက္ခဒီလိုမျိုးဗြဟ္မစိုရတရား၄ပါးကကိုကနေစမှာပါဗျာကိုကနေစပြီးတော့မှကိုကနေလေ့ကျင့်တော့မှတခြားcommunity တွေရောကိုရဲ့မိဘတွေကိုတွေကိုရောအဲ့ဒီအနေမှာတစ်စက်နောက်ဆုံးတော့ enemy ထိပါပေါ့ဘုံလည်းသိပါတယ်ဗျာအဲ့ဒီဟာတွေအကုန်လုံးပါဝင်ပါတယ်ဗျာတပည့်တော်တို့ကတော့ဒီဟာကတော့ terminology နဲ့ဒါပြောသွားတာပေါ့ဗျာမှန်ပါဘုံပြောတာမှန်ပါတယ်ဗျာတင်ပါ I think we will have a 15 minutes break so we will come back at what time? 5 past, yes. Okay.